Well, welcome back to the Henry George School for our lecture series on Daniel Boone. So Ed, you could start within a minute.
Well, welcome back, everyone. I was chatting with Ibrahima and Michael earlier before we, 10 minutes or so ago, about my week away. I was in St. Augustine, Florida, for a tour of that historic city. And if you've never been there, I would recommend it. It's a very unique place with a lot of history, Spanish, indigenous, British, early American. It's a very eclectic place with a diverse population of people who've migrated there from all parts of the world, really. One of the tour guides was an ex-British citizen, and there were many people who we encountered who were born and raised in St. Augustine and have lived there all their lives, and they love it. So I'll just pass that on as a recommendation if you're looking for a place to go where the climate is warm, to get away for the winter, and you want some exposure to early American history. So we're back to talk about our friend Daniel Boone and his life, and I want to pick up just a little bit of where we left off 2 weeks ago, so that you might remember. I had this image up on the screen. It is a picture of a salt lick, and the reason it was important in Daniel Boone's story, you may remember, is that in February of 1778, Boone was captured by a large band of Shawnee warriors who were accompanied by several British agents while he was out hunting game for a group that was engaged in salt making at a place called the Blue Licks. And of course, in all times and everywhere, salt is an extremely important mineral to have, and particularly for the preservation of meat and for other purposes. And when the Shawnees captured Daniel, he realized very quickly that the force was so large that it could easily advance and take Boonesboro, and this would have involved many casualties, maybe atrocities, and the burning of the fort and people's crops and homes, etc. So he came up with a plan to try to redirect the efforts of the Shawnee. And so John Bayliss, in his biography, recounts what that plan was. He writes, Boone told Blackfish, the leader of the Shawnee, he would himself go with him and persuade the young man at the Salt Lick to surrender. Boone further explained that it was too cold to move the women and children now, meaning from Boonesboro, but in the spring it would be easy enough to take them to Detroit. Blackfish agreed, but added that if Boone failed to persuade his salt makers to surrender, his own life might be the penalty. And so the reason for Blackfish accepting this proposal was he didn't want his own men to be potentially injured or killed. I mean, this is one of the important issues that needs to be understood, the difference between the Indian tribes and the whites, and that is the importance of the members of their community. Small, indigenous tribal communities with only a limited number of warriors, they couldn't afford to lose men, whereas the white settlers basically kept replacing themselves, no matter how many were lost to the frontier, to the Indian fights, or even the fights between the French and the British. There were always more settlers coming from the east into the frontier to fill that void. So Blackfish wanted to protect his own men as much as he knew that when he took the captured prisoners to Detroit, that the British would pay them a significant amount. And you remember what happened to Daniel. He convinced his salt makers to to allow them to be captured and take them to Detroit to be turned over to the British, and the British would pay Blackfish for every prisoner. But Blackfish then ordered Daniel Boone to run a gauntlet. And this is a very typical way that prisoners were treated by the Indians. And many prisoners died in running the gauntlet if they couldn't make it through, to show their bravery. And sometimes the Indians were pretty adamant, depending upon the prisoners, whether they thought the prisoner had merit or was weak, whatever. So a prisoner that was crying and seemed weak, he would never make it through the gauntlet. I don't know, but I haven't read in the history books, maybe someone else knows, whether they ever required women to run the gauntlet. That I'm not sure. But anyway, Blackfish ordered Daniel to run the gauntlet, and he reminded Daniel that he had not included himself in Blackfish's promise not to require the salt makers to run. However, it didn't turn out as the Shawnee warriors expected, as you might remember from last week. Here's what John Bayliss tells us. Boone surprised the warriors by zigzagging from side to side, escaping the worst of the ordeal. When one man stepped squarely into the path, hoping to get in a good blow, Boone butted him in the chest with his head, knocking the eager redskin sprawling amid shouts of Shawnee laughter. So Boone, by doing this, just his status increased within the Shawnee tribe. He might have been a prisoner, but he was someone that they respected very, very sincerely and deeply. So what happens then? Some of the captured frontiersmen are held by the Shawnee to be adopted by them. The remainder are turned over to the British at Detroit. And when Daniel Boone gets there, he's treated well by the British. They provide him with a horse, a saddle, a bridle, and a blanket. But Blackfish declines to sell Daniel Boone to the British, and brings Daniel back to their village, where he goes through an adoption ceremony, becomes the son of Blackfish, and he's given a new name, translated as Big Turtle, the name Sheltawi. So more than might have been expected, captured whites adopted well to Indian life. John Farragher tells us about that. He says, young adoptees often became so well adjusted to their new lives that they elected to remain with the Indians. And many of those who returned to their former lives continued to be attached to their adoptive families. Many returned captives later escaped back to their Indian families. Let me ask you, what do you think? Why do you think that might have been the case? If you have some thoughts on that, raise your yellow hand and I'll recognize you. Marty.
Thanks, Ed. Well, I think that considering the life on the frontier, the indigenous communities had been, living for, I don't know, centuries or longer, and had essentially figured out how to live comfortably within the, I don't know, I guess we'd call it the wilderness, but they understood it. So it's kind of like a lot of certainty. So it's kind of like, a young teenager deciding to sit watching TV on a couch or going out and getting a job, so.
Well, I would say it's, one of the big differences was that the tribal structure was largely non-hierarchical, and they lived cooperatively much more so than the whites. I'm hearing somebody with their mic on in the background. Okay, well, I mean, that really sums it up. I mean, people, some of the young people who were captured found living with the tribal people to be a very acceptable way of life, with a lot of congenial relations, etc. Of course, there was a great deal of risk. Their villages might be attacked by not just whites, but by other tribes that they were not in on good terms with, or they were competing for resources and territory, etc. So that's just an interesting observation that he makes, and certainly that continues all the way through the rest of history during the time that the frontier existed, and when whites interacted with the tribal people all across North America. Now, Daniel did all he could to convince the Shawnees that he was now one of them. I mean, he engaged in their activities. He hunted with them. He tried to get to a point where they became convinced that he was committed to now being a Shawnee and no longer was white. But on the 16th of June, 1778, he managed to escape and make his way back to Boonesboro. By that time, the town's defenses had really deteriorated in his absence. And the reason is simple for this. The settlers simply did not have the time to do all that frontier life required and take care of the fort as well. I mean, they are struggling, day to day, week to week, to sustain themselves with food, and taking care of the fort was not a priority, even though the risk was always there that they might be attacked. So when Daniel comes back, he begins to immediately supervising the strengthening of the fort in a number of important ways. Once he gets the fort to a point where he thinks it can withstand an attack, he leaves the fort accompanied by about 20 men, crosses the Ohio River to try to determine whether Blackfish was in fact preparing for a siege against the fort. They made their way to the Shawnee village, but it was empty of warriors. And so immediately Daniel concludes that Blackfish was in fact on his way to Boonesboro. And so he and his group make their way back as fast as possible to try to defend the fort. And in fact, there was a force of about 450 Shawnees, Chippewa, and a dozen French Canadians that reached Boonesboro not very long after Boone's patrol made it back. So over the next few days, Blackfish tried to convince Boonesboro's leaders to surrender. So they didn't attack the fort right away. They called out the leaders, and there was a lot of discussion. Should they surrender? This huge Indian force was there, but Boone convinced the militia leaders that they should stay and defend the fort, that was their best chance of surviving. So eventually Blackfish unleashed his force on the fort, and they laid siege to it. This is not something that Indians did very often. It was not their style of fighting. Their style of fighting was to try to lure the defenders out of the fort so that they could ambush them. But Boone was there and smart enough to keep the militia leaders from taking the bait. And so when the siege failed, after 8 days, Blackfish finally gave up, and his force withdrew. So despite the outcome, some of the people in the fort suspected Daniel Boone of having gone over to British interests. They said they thought, had he not been captured and spent a long time with the Shawnees before finally escaping, why did it take him so long to leave the Shawnee? The fact that Boone's surrender of himself and the salt makers at Blue Licks had kept Blackfish from attacking Boonesboro when it was ill prepared meant little to those who found reasons to dislike Daniel Boone. 2 militia officers, in fact, demanded a courts-martial of Boone. The evidence was all on Daniel's side, and he was acquitted of all charges. John Bakeless provides some details of what was involved with the court martial. He says, if Boone had not acted as he did, Blackfish's war party would probably have captured Boonesboro and scalped the very men who later held the court martial, besides surprising and killing both the salt makers and the relief party, which was just leaving Boonesboro. As a result of Boone's adroitness, no salt makers were killed, and the relief party was able to get back to shelter. Thanks to wholly to him, Boonesboro was attacked, not when it was weak, but months later when it had plenty of warning, was in good repair, and as events proved, was able to stand a siege. So it's a clear indication that there was a fair amount of jealousy with the status that Daniel Boone had with his own people and with the tribal people as well, and of course with the British, who treated him very well when he was in Detroit. So following the acquittal, Daniel heads east to reunite with his wife and children. And while he's away, the Kentuckians carried the war to the Shawnee, surprising them at their village of Little Chillicothe. Blackfish was among the casualties, mortally wounded during the battle. And so this is just a plaque at the site of that original village. The Boones then returned to Kentucky together in October of the next year. So he spent some time with his family away from Boonesboro, but finally came back the following October with more settlers coming out of North Carolina. Yet, because of the lingering tensions with some of the Boonesboro settlers, he chose land several miles away where he began construction of a new settlement that became known as Boone Station. And this is a cabin that's on that location today with this marker sitting there. He now refocused his energy on his desire for more land for himself and his family members. So early in 1780, he returns to Virginia, intent on purchasing state land warrants. Making the trip in winter, he hoped to get there ahead of other land speculators. But he ran into some difficulty, as he often did during his life. What happened to him? Well, he is said to have carried well over $20,000 with him to buy the land warrants. While he was staying at a Virginia inn, he was robbed while sleeping. And biographers think he was more than likely drugged. The worst part was that he had been entrusted with the money of others, and that money was now taken from him. So he felt very guilty, and he was determined that eventually he would pay those people back. In the tavern where he was staying, they did a search, found a bit of the money, but the bulk of it was gone, and the probable robbers were also gone and not to be found again. Now, there was still plenty of fighting to come against the British, even at this point in the war, and they had strong tribal allies. Daniel had several narrow escapes while he was on patrol. And then in April of 1781, while he was serving in the new state assembly located in Charlottesville, Virginia, the town was attacked by the British, led by Sir Banastre Tarleton. I don't know if Michael knows anything about Banastre Tarleton, but his character was featured in the movie The Patriot, and he was a feared warrior who raided against the Continental Army in the South in particular. But in this case, Boone, along with many leading Americans, were captured, and remarkably, they were eventually released on parole if they promised not to take up arms against British forces. I guess they did, because they were released. But as John Farragher says in his book, he says, if so, it was a pledge he did not keep. And there were those in Kentucky who pointed to this as further evidence that oaths meant nothing to Daniel Boone. But I thought that it's very interesting that Tarleton actually released Boone and the others who were certainly guilty of treason against the British Empire. What the reasons were, I don't know, but maybe it was simply because they were moving fast and they didn't want to take prisoners. I'm sure that some historian has dealt with that issue. Exactly when he was released isn't known, but by the end of August, he was back at Boonesboro. And in November, he was back in his seat at the state legislature. I have this image here because it is in fact the Capitol in Richmond, but it is from Colonel Dodson's book, The Capital of the Commonwealth of Virginia at Richmond. And I have no idea whether that particular Colonel Dodson is a distant relative of mine or not. But I'm glad to see that at least one of my possible ancestors paid some attention to history. And John Bakeless says about his time at the Capitol, he does not seem to have been very assiduous in his duties. In December, the House ordered the Sergeant at Arms to take Daniel Boone and other absent members into custody. They needed enough people back in the state assembly to take votes, and apparently a lot of these folks weren't around when the time was required for them to be there. Well, as usual, Boone is anxious to get back to the frontier. And during 1792, a lot of the smaller Kentucky settlements were coming under frequent attack. And in fact, several large militia forces were ambushed and suffered heavy casualties. On the eve of an ambush on the Licking River that took many lives, Daniel Boone did his best to raise the alarm to no avail. And here again is one of the problems that he had with his fellow settlers, is that they knew the risks, but they often let down their guard, and as a result, many more were killed by these skirmishes and by small bands of warriors, even who were going across the countryside looking for people who were exposed. And in fact, before the major encounter, here's what Bakeless says about what Daniel Boone had on his mind. And it's pretty self-evident when you hear what he says. Daniel Boone was doing some thinking. The leisurely Indian retreat, the failure to conceal their trail, the obvious confidence of the retreating invaders. What did they mean? Had the Indians wished to escape, they could have traveled at twice the speed they were making, or they could have broken up into many small bands, which scattering in all directions would leave no trail whatsoever. So Boone knew that they were laying a trap. And unfortunately, he couldn't convince the militia leaders of this. And so they sent out a fairly large force to join in battle. And many of them were killed in the battle, including Boone's son, Israel. And this is a marker of where his son was killed in that battle. So you can see that frontier families needed to have a good many children in order for at least some of them to live to maturity and produce their own progeny as well. The death rate was pretty significant in these families for all the reasons that living in the wilderness might cause. Well, at the end of September, about 1,000 men under George Rogers Clark, one of the heroes of the American Revolution and amazing military strategists, for the time. They set out determined to destroy the fighting capacity and will of the Shawnees once and for all. And Daniel Boone commanded his own detachment in this force. The Shawnees escaped beyond Clark's reach, however, but they burned the Shawnee capital and they destroyed the crops that the Shawnee depended on to get them through the winter. And so the Shawnee were forced to withdraw and try to get help from the British in Detroit. But they suffered pretty significantly. And this is not the only time that the Americans went on a slash and burn mission against the tribal people. In Pennsylvania and New York, the General John Sullivan made a similar kind of trip against the Iroquois, all the way, chasing the Iroquois all the way into Canada from the Susquehanna Valley and up through New York, and burning every village they encountered and burning all their crops, tearing up orchards, et cetera, et cetera. And so that action generally led to more deaths among the tribal people than actual fighting. Well, peace between the Americans and the British was now on the horizon. Preliminary negotiations began in November of 1792, and the final treaty was signed on the 19th of April, 1783. And it's worth noting that during this whole time, fighting still continued. Cornwallis had surrendered. There were still armies in the field, and the Indians were still being encouraged to attack on the frontier. And it took a long time, even when the final peace treaty was signed, for the news of the treaty to reach North America and spread into the wilderness. So you can imagine that there's more action going on, more ambushes, more fighting, even months after, in fact, the formal treaty was signed. Well, Daniel, now with the war coming to a conclusion, he has to deal with his land issues. In the early 1780s, his land claims at Boone Station were challenged. He turned his farm over to his son-in-law and moved to Limestone on the Ohio River, which is already growing into a booming river port. He now began to engage in other activities. So his project at Limestone was, in fact, to oversee the construction of a port and to assist arriving settlers. Many made their way by flatboat after reaching Pittsburgh, and the Boones remained at Limestone from 1783 to 1789. And while they were there, they operated a tavern, and Daniel directed the laying out of a road all the way to Lexington, Kentucky. In 1786, Limestone was incorporated under the name Maysville, and that town still exists today. His fortunes had improved to a point where his household included as many as 7 enslaved members. It's worth stating, I think, that at that time, only 4 of 10 white households included enslaved persons. And so this leads John Farragher to tell us about Boone. As the importance of slavery increased with the developing economy, thousands of anti-slavery Kentuckians departed in disgust for the Northwest Territory, where the institution was outlawed. Not only were the Boones among the minority who owned slaves, but they held about twice the number of the typical slave-owning household and carried their servants along when they emigrated from Kentucky to Missouri at the end of the century. So Boone is a complicated person, and his morality is complicated. How he, fighting for independence, yearning for the independent existence that he had, how he was able to reconcile in his own mind claiming other persons, other human beings as his property, I don't know. There's nothing that he ever wrote about it, and there's very little in the biographies describing the conditions under which his enslaved persons lived in his home. Well, another thing that's going on in this region is during these long years of warfare, a lot had changed. So farmers were now growing corn, and some of this found its way into one of the more profitable products the region would ever produce, and that's whiskey. Of course, the logic, the economic logic for producing whiskey out of corn is tremendous. I mean, first of all, it's a lot easier to ship, and it is once it's produced and aged a bit, there is a ready market for it, and the price of it's going to be, pretty constant. Whereas for raw corn and other, farm goods, who knows what the price is going to bring if you can get it to the market on time. John Farragher says about all this: over the mountains and down the Ohio, pioneer men and women streamed in, adding their number to the 12,000 who already had settled west of the Appalachians. Men opened the first commercial distilleries for the manufacture and sale of corn whiskey. The trustees of Transylvania Seminary in Lexington met to organize the first institution of higher education in the West, and politicians spoke of the possibility that Kentucky might break away from Virginia to become the 14th of the Confederated States. So it's not taking very long for Kentucky to fill up and meet the requirements eventually under the U.S. Constitution for Kentucky to be considered not just a territory, but to apply for statehood, which it eventually does. The riches of Kentucky were this same year documented by this fellow, John Filson, who was a schoolmaster from Chester County in Pennsylvania, and he used his inheritance to buy Kentucky land warrants. The second part of his book, The Adventures of Colonel Daniel Boone, was based on Filson's conversations with Boone. So this is one of the better first-hand records of what Boone actually said and thought. But it was certainly embellished a good deal by Filson. As Farragher tells us, Filson structured Boone's narrative to read like an epic. Filson related a succession of thrilling episodes in which Boone rescues his daughter and two young girlfriends from Indian kidnappers. Is captured by Indians, but manages to escape to lead the defense of Boonesboro against savage siege, and suffers during an awful massacre in which more than 60 Kentucky fighters under his command, including his second-born son, are slaughtered in an Indian ambush. Just with that, one paragraph, one can see why it attracted attention by the film industry when Hollywood started to begin to produce films about the colonial era and about its heroes, and Daniel Boone certainly stood out among them all. In 1787, he is elected to the Virginia State Assembly from Bourbon County in Kentucky. In the town of Maysville, he's not only owned a tavern, but he works as a surveyor, and he engaged in horse trading and, of course, speculating in land. And here's John Farragher again on Boone's activities. He says, during the height of the land boom, Boone's surveying business netted him a nice income. Competing for clients and charging what the market would bear, Boone had all the work he could handle. He was in great demand because he knew how to find the fresh springs, salt licks, and meadows. He was willing to go where others would not dare, despite continuing Indian raids and ambushes. Although on occasion, even Boone noted that certain locations were too much exposed to danger to survey at this time. I wonder if you remember what surveying involved for Daniel Boone, what the technical aspects of his work was. Anybody remember? I think I mentioned it earlier, but if I didn't, I'll have to do so now. But maybe someone knows, even independent of what I said in the last couple of weeks. Any thoughts? Well, one of the things about the Kentucky frontier was it was filled with trees. And so, Boone, as a surveyor, what he would do would put what were called tomahawk marks on trees. And then he had surveying equipment that would line up to other trees and continue. And based on that, on those marks, many of them which remained for decades, he would then file land claims for himself and for others, depending on who was paying him to do the surveying work. So all throughout this region, for thousands of acres, there were Daniel Boone's tomahawk marks on the trees. His initials, basically DB, and other surveyors did the same thing. And then they would write it all up and describe it as clearly as possible, and then take it back to the capital or wherever the land office was, and file their claim and pay for that claim whatever was required at the time, based on who owned the land, whether it was the state or some private land company. Well, for most of 1787, he was also occupied with his duties as a legislator. So on the surface, he looked like one of the wealthiest persons in Kentucky. However, by the end of the next year, he decided to leave Kentucky for good. He had financial troubles, he had creditors, and there were just too many newcomers coming in. And the region was now being referred to as part of the Northwest Territory. So he had to deal with lawyers and land grabbers who saw to it that his land claims were invalidated. He just failed to fully comply with the law in all cases, and someone was able to challenge his claim, bring suit against him, and he would lose a lot of the land that he thought was his. When Simon Kenton, his frontiersman buddy, asked him if he was ever coming back to Kentucky, here's what Boone responded. And this is in his writing, as at least one historian has provided it. So I don't know if it's 100% accurate, but it certainly sounds like what he might say. He says, "Ain't nothing to come back to, Simon. My land's gone. Most of my friends has got themselves killed. Man can't move around no more without bumping into somebody. No, I ain't coming back. My oldest boy, Jesse, he's got him a little place near the salt works, about 18 mile up Little Sandy. Reckon I'll hunker with him some, then maybe head on to Missouri. Hear tell it's a fine land." So he's eventually going to make his way to Missouri. He delays his eventual departure by first moving to the settlement of Point Pleasant, which is in the center of Kentucky. And 2 years later, he's actually living back in Virginia in Kanawha County. In the Virginia State Legislature, he serves on a committee on religion and another dealing with licenses. And then sometime around 1794, he moves once again to Charleston, which is in modern West Virginia. So his intent is eventually to get to Missouri, but he doesn't seem to be any great hurry. But he's now approaching his 60th year. He was still physically strong. and an able frontiersman. His troubles now almost all involve debt and his faulty land claims. He had, in a number of cases, sold land to others the government said he did not really own. So many of those men who opened the frontier were in a similar position. So now the people that he sold land to, who paid him, are suing him for their money back because they're not able to keep the land that Daniel sold to them. The year 1795 finds him returned to the Blue Licks. He builds this cabin. He and his family lived here, in fact, till 1799, when they left for Missouri in the Spanish-held Louisiana territory. So it's 1799. Keep that in mind. It's not too far in the distance that things are going to change very much in Louisiana, of course. So here's a rough map of what it looks like. There's Spanish Louisiana. There's the West claimed by Spain. And all of this is about to change. Daniel's son, Daniel Morgan, had headed west to explore, to hunt and trap along the Mississippi River in what was then called the Missouri country. A visit with the Spanish lieutenant governor, a man named Don Zion Trudeau, resulted in an invitation for the Boones to resettle in the Spanish Louisiana territory. Daniel Morgan Boone made his decision and returned to consult with his father and the rest of the family, intent on coming back to establish a new settlement. Marty.
So I'm trying to understand the period of time that Spain owned that Louisiana territory, because we all know that France under Napoleon sold it to
The United States, to Jefferson.
Jefferson, yeah. So how long did the Spain own that before they gave it to France?
Well, Spain basically had physical control of the territory from the 1600s on. I mean, there were some French explorers, but not many. The French basically stuck to the Great Lakes area, and so you see this map going all the way up to what is eventually became British Canada. So there was, so that territory was very loosely settled. The Spanish, of course, their way of doing things was to establish Catholic missions and then build small farming communities around them and try to convert the indigenous population to Catholicism. And certainly, all of what eventually became Texas and the Southwest, all the way up to the Northwest area, was then still claimed by Spain. So in 1799, there's only 4 years left that Spain is going to have a role in this territory. And so I get to that story pretty quick. So long after the elder Daniel Boone long after, when his son came back, Daniel met with him and they decided now is the time. And so they together headed for Missouri together. Their party reached St. Louis in October of 1799. They were welcomed personally by the lieutenant governor, and the governor basically immediately appointed Daniel an administrator of the territory and gave him responsibility for distribution of land to the settlers that Daniel brought with him. So even at this point in 1799, there were rumors that Louisiana would be ceded to France. It hadn't occurred yet, but here's what John Bakeless said that needed to be done. He writes, to make quite certain, therefore, that all land grants fell within the unquestioned period of Spanish jurisdiction, they were carefully antedated. Daniel Boone's first grant bears the date of January 28, 1798. a time when he was still in Kentucky. So they were very concerned about what was going to happen if France took over. Would the French honor the land grants that were made under Spanish rule? So that's what they did to try to strengthen their claims. Well, settled now in Missouri, Daniel Boone returned to the woods, hunting and trapping. He was back in his environment. He was back in a happy mode of living. In 1802, however, he was pretty severely injured when his hand was caught in one of his own beaver traps. And this was winter, and it was freezing cold. He had to make it back to camp with his fingers still caught in the steel trap. Eventually that healed. On another trip, he was robbed by a band of Indians, and his hunting was later interrupted a number of times by a worsening attacks of rheumatism. So he made it to 60 pretty healthy, but the conditions of his living conditions were starting to get to him pretty significantly. Under Spanish authority, however, he exercised a great deal of power over the affairs of the new settlers. As John Bakeless tells us, he assigned vacant lands, he kept order, he punished crime, he was official witness to notes, he settled estates. Yet even with these heavy responsibilities, he did find time to pursue his lifelong interests. Farragut tells us, during the first winter in Missouri, Boone hunted the Femme Osage. I don't know, I couldn't find out exactly where that is. If anyone knows the Missouri area and where that might be, let us know. Familiarizing himself with the country, experiencing a resurgence of his health, he determined to resume his lifelong pattern of annual long hunts. It was like stepping back 3 or 4 decades to his first trans-Appalachian hunts, and the experience lifted Boone's spirits. Now, on the 9th of March, 1804, Spain handed the Louisiana Territory over to France. A day later, Louisiana became United States territory. So there's a great deal of chaos of what's going to now happen. Daniel Boone would once again be faced with a lot of challenges to his status as a major landowner. And his major problem turned out to be the fact that he had not, as required under Spanish land grants, cleared hardly any of the land given to him. The Spanish had overlooked this and weren't really going to enforce it. Well, what the French would have done, no one knows. But the Americans were being fairly rigorous in their enforcement of the requirements. John Bakeless says, the United States had given its board of land commissioners no discretion. Land claimants had to show that they were making use of their lands, not merely speculating. And of course, Daniel was, in fact, a major speculator. His family and friends settled much of the land as well, and they worked it. But Daniel was really looking to make gains on selling the land that he had been granted by the Spanish. Well, what happens? Well, it's interesting because it takes several years of fighting to keep the land. And he's finally notified in February of 1814 that President James Madison had signed a bill awarding him just 1,000 acres in Missouri. Within months, he had to sell all of this land to satisfy his creditors. So he's back to a position where he's almost landless and pretty well broke. Madison now has to fight another war. It's the War of 1812 that is erupting. Daniel's now 78 years old, and he volunteers for military service, but he's left behind while his two surviving sons entered the Army, as did a grandson named James Calloway, who was killed. So he's 78 years old, and there's not much left for him. We're actually going to finish up tonight pretty easily. I didn't know how fast we get through this material, but this will be our last evening together, apparently. Well, late in the winter of 1813, his wife Rebecca becomes quite ill. After about a week, she is said to have died quietly on March 18th. She was in her 74th year, and they had been together mostly all of their lives. So even at his advanced age, he continues to roam the surrounding countryside. He had hopes of traveling further west to see the Great Salt Lake, and some people claim they had run into him along the Rocky Mountains. Whether he ever actually made it there on one of these trips is not verified. In July of 1817, he makes a trip back to Kentucky to visit an old friend. And when word spreads that he had returned, everyone in the area came to see him. And while he's there, he pays off every creditor who still had a claim against him. He wanted to make sure that by the end of his life, he owed nothing to anyone. Well, as he enters his 8th decade, his health really began to fail him. His eyesight was getting poor, and he was forced to give up hunting and trapping. The end came at age 83 on the 26th of September, 1820, after taking ill and remaining in bed for 3 days. John Faragher describes the situation of his death as follows. He says, "Death had no fear for him," he said. "In his life, he had tried to do right, had struggled to pay his debts, been charitable to the poor, and now he trusted in the mercy of God. When morning came, he requested that all of his relatives and slaves come to his bedside, that he might bid them goodbye. He had a kind word for everyone, asking them not to grieve, for he had lived to a good old age and was going to a world of happiness." Well, that's not the end of his story. 25 years later, the people of Kentucky brought back the bodies of Daniel and Rebecca, and this is where they were reburied. They established that gravesite for him and that monument. John Bayliss says, "Kentucky, which had driven him out, received him back with splendor. Nearly every county was represented, and there were a lot more counties in Kentucky now than Daniel Boone ever heard of." John Faragher adds this: "On Saturday, September 13, 1845, several thousand people assembled in the streets of Frankfort to witness marching bands, state dignitaries, military companies, and fraternal organizations that proceeded from the Capitol building across the river and up the hill to the cemetery, led by 4 white horses drawing the hearse carrying the Boone's coffins." Quite the celebration for the return of this frontier hero to Kentucky. And with that, his story ends, or at least my telling of it ends here. And so we have some plenty of time for discussion. If you have questions, comments, we can talk about the frontier and all of this. Marty.
Yeah, so I guess I'll get back to the my hometown, which was skipped over by the History Channel. But so what was notable?
And what's your hometown?
No, the hometown is well, it's Monroe, Michigan, which is south of Detroit.
Okay.
But it was once called Frenchtown. But the reason I brought it up and what came to mind was the talk about Kentucky, because the Kentuckians were volunteering to fight, to the north around Detroit, and upon their loss, they were pretty much massacred. But when the news came back, they named a lot of the counties in Kentucky, after the soldiers that had lost up in my hometown. So that was kind of an interesting point of history that. So that was.
Yeah, well, this is all part of the same, epic adventure in the movement of settlers, from the East and immigrants coming in. There's Alan Eckert devotes one of his historical narratives to the settlement of Michigan and Chicago, Illinois, and that whole area. And it's a very interesting book to read. I think the title of that particular volume was Gateway to Empire, and it covers a lot of what you're talking about.
Yeah, so I guess I'm encouraging anybody who visits the Detroit area to make sure that they stop off in my hometown of Monroe, which is on I-75, just north of Toledo. They've got a nice welcome center, and they've got a museum next to the battlefield. And what's probably most interesting is the photo of General Custer before Bighorn, of course, with the survivors of the River Raisin Massacre, which is what that was called. So you can kind of understand the mindset of Custer wanting to get even with the Indians that slaughtered the early Monroe settlers.
How about that?
Yeah. And if
Alan, I'll put you in the queue. I've got a couple people before you, but I'll get to you. Michael.
Well, thanks for this, a wonderful presentation over the last three weeks. It's opened my eyes. The question I'm centering on tonight is about land claims. You had that unique way of marking your territory, a bit like a dog leaves its mark around on the trees, but he can't substantiate it when the nature of legal title starts to evolve to establish, and this is the last question, new or involving, what is the situation today as to official title for land in the United States?
What is the situation today? Well, I guess the best answer I could give you is that one is taking a big chance if you acquire property without paying for title insurance. Because what the title insurance company does is it does a search to see if there are any liens on your property or any claims that exist. And so, title insurance is something that people have to get because there can be competing claims, for the same piece of property. There's all sorts of liens that can be placed on it, mechanics liens, tax liens. So I assume that in Britain, you have the equivalent. You have title insurance companies that insure clear title.
No, we just have what they call freehold land or leasehold, etc. So it's I'm looking, why I asked that question, because I'm looking into this, the nature of freehold, and it's granted in medieval times by the king. The crown owns all land and you have a freehold title, but it's the land still belongs to the crown in theory, which I find very disturbing. But anyway, I love the explanation of, when there was so much land, everyone was grabbing as much as they could, marking it out, and then the next, as the settlers came in and all want the same, you had to sort of establish some sort of legal title, and that scenario, it interests me very much.
Well, as Daniel Boone learned, those who got there first didn't necessarily get to keep what they thought they were taking, because behind them were the politicians and the lawyers.
Exactly.
So Joffrey.
Thank you very much. It makes me wish I attended the other two. Sorry, I missed. But did Henry George ever mention Daniel Boone in any of his works? Just curious.
I don't know. I would have to do a search to see if he ever did. I mean, when during his days as a journalist writing for a newspaper about the West, you know, perhaps he did. I don't know.
Oh, whether he did or not, I appreciate what you've just done because it is very relevant to George's. I wanted to make a comment as to why some people would like to prefer living with the indigenous peoples. I have lived among them, and tell you frankly, if I were to retire, I would like to retire with them and the indigenous peoples I've lived, whether they would be the Abyan, the
Well, you know,
Dumagats.
the equivalent for many others of us is the idea of downsizing. That once we get to retirement age, we'd like to simplify our lives to a degree. And one way to do that is to, you know, get rid of all of the unnecessary property and things that we have held on to, and begin to live a much more simpler life and enjoy actually living. So maybe that's the equivalent of what these people found when they joined the tribal societies and decided to make their way with them.
Yeah,
By the way,
yes, yeah.
Ibrahim is recording this, so you
Yes.
should be able to get access to the whole, you know, 3 weeks and listen to it over again.
Oh, thank you very much.
You're
Thank you
welcome.
very much, Edward.
Alan, good to have
Yeah.
you. Nice to
Yeah,
see you.
thank you very much, Ed. And thank you for this excellent presentation. I really appreciate it. And I was just going to add to Marty Rowland's comment about Monroe. My mother was born there, and the Monroe Museum apparently has the musket from my great grandfather. Was her grandfather who fought in the Civil War for Michigan at the Battle of Gettysburg, but they donated his musket to the Monroe Museum, so you can go there. But I have another more pertinent question, and that is, what insights can we take from Daniel Boone relative to my dream of having a location where we can have our conferences and meetings? It may be a large building, it may be a mansion that we can take over. Instead of going to these conferences in these expensive corporate hotels that are probably don't have much.
Well, you're getting off into a very different topic, Alan. I don't know.
I am, and I apologize, but there it is.
Well, let me say this simply, that the frontier existed at as a place of imagination. And so perhaps my best answer to you is finding a place that triggers the imagination of people. You know, I don't know if you were on earlier. You know, last week I was in St. Augustine, Florida. St. Augustine, Florida is definitely a place that triggers the imagination. It's just the interaction of cultures across 500 years of history. It's a remarkable place with the incredible diversity of people who have gone there to live because it has triggered their imagination.
Nice. That's a beautiful answer to my dreamy question. So thank you very much, Ed. I appreciate it.
Well, Ellen, it's always great to be with you. You always have intriguing things to say.
Well, likewise. Thank you.
Scott Baker.
Hi.
Good evening. How are you tonight, Scott?
Hi. So I don't know if you're all aware of Tolosa, which is the utopian vision, which envisions using Georgist land value tax to maintain it. It doesn't have a place yet, but it has some billionaire backers. So that's an important thing. I've been on the seminars several times. They have good webinars, good production values. It seems like they want to locate somewhere in the Southwest, given their renderings, which were all very professionally done.
It's their version of Boonesboro.
Yes. And very politically correct and very energy efficient and everything else. But
I mean, they do, you know, they had Josh Vincent on there at one point, and so they're definitely considering a Georgist system to maintain it. How
Well-
far it gets, I don't know if any of us will still be around when they actually establish it,
No.
but we'll see.
Well,
Ed, to add to what Scott was just saying, actually, I think you are familiar, you must be familiar with Tom Rossman, who attends our classes almost every evening. He's not here tonight. He is one of the people who are involved in that project. And the Henry George School is having a page on our website that features, you know, whatever is happening on Telosa. So you may want to tune in on our website to also see what's going on.
Good to know.
Yeah.
so does anyone else have a thought, a reaction to Daniel Boone's life? All that it encompassed, the time in which he lived and the adventures he, experienced. Marty?
Yeah, I thought I'd keep the conversation going on. You know, sometimes when I speak, somebody would say, "Oh, you shouldn't have said that," or whatever. And I'm thinking in terms of the Henry George School of Social Science itself. Yeah, I really enjoyed your presentation, but I did hear you say, for example, our good friend Daniel Boone, and I'm thinking in terms of the social issues of our day, about a guy who owned slaves and killed Indians. So I don't know if there needs to be a disclaimer about Henry George School of Social Science position on Daniel Boone, but
Well, I don't think the Henry George School of Social Science ought to have a position on Daniel Boone. I mean, as I've said, his actions are controversial. He's a controversial individual who was elevated to hero status because of his accomplishments, but his decision to own enslaved people, how did he reconcile that with his sense of morality? And certainly none of us here would ever endorse that sort of behavior.
yeah, and I
It
guess
is part of our historical reality that we have to face and deal with. And it's a very complex issue in terms of civilizations. I would say this, this is my own view, but blue-eyed people would enslave brown-eyed people if they could get away with it and it had economic advantage. Henry George made one of the most astute observations about human beings, and that is civilization is a thin veneer over our character as uncivilized beings living in a very violent and uncompromising world. And so, the whole mistreatment of one group of people by another is consistent throughout history. And George wrote, that the end of chattel slavery, while that was extremely important to achieve, led to wage slavery. And immigrants who came from other parts of the world besides Africa and off the boat were put on a train to go to work in the coal mines in Appalachia and never to see, another outside community. Work under those conditions. This is something that all humanity needs to recognize that there was such an extent of immorality and evil, and that human beings are still guilty of that extensively based on what's happening today. And if we stand for anything, those of us who teach political economy based on Henry George, it is to denounce that behavior.
yeah, no, I thought that was a beautiful answer. I'm glad that I asked the question that at least elucidated that answer. That's good.
I'm sorry, my telephone is ringing and I can't find it. That's
It looks like Michael has a question. Michael, you want to go ahead?
Yes. I was particularly fascinated by your description of the time of Daniel Boone, when the Indians and the white settlers, etc. And I've never experienced it quite like that. It was quite a busy time, wasn't it? It was quite an active time. And what came to mind was the role of the patriot. It seems to be a particular American expression, patriot. And I've heard, I mean, that film you mentioned, I didn't like that film particularly. I didn't see it, but I saw a little bit of it. I didn't like the idea of patriots killing all these worthwhile Englishmen, really. But anyway, we won't go into that. But the idea of a patriot, what is the role of in the world today of a patriot, where we can more or less go anywhere and settle anywhere, but we retain our nostalgia, perhaps that can be explained, of the old country, really. So can you become a real indigenous patriot without harping back to your your other loyalties which you've left behind? It might be a tricky question, that.
Well, what strikes me, I guess, and I'll respond to this in terms of each of us who lives in a quote unquote sovereign nation state, that we have a certain sense of citizenship, and so patriotism about our nation state, about our culture, about our history, about our system of governance. And some of us have a greater and stronger, deep feeling of patriotism for that sort of collection of values than others do. And suppose that the longer that one's family has existed in that nation state and has experienced a decent quality of life, the instinct to be patriotic about it is probably stronger than if you are, for example, someone who belongs to a minority that's been oppressed for generation after generation after generation.
I think it's an interesting question.
Well, you have the same issues in the UK.
Yeah, I know, very much
yeah.
so, you know.
I mean, you think about Brexit, correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the issues for, quote, persons of Anglo-Saxon ethnicity who can trace their families back many generations living in the British Isles is that you're the too many people who are from different cultures, different religions, different ethnicities, different races have come in and diluted the stock of the people who have lived there the longest. And yet from a standpoint of human rights, I think Henry George would certainly agree with this, that none of us has a greater claim on any portion of the earth than any other, that the earth is our equal birthright. And so we should be free to move from one part of the planet to any other part of the planet we choose, with certain constraints for health and safety. You know, if I have a communicable disease or I'm a criminal, I shouldn't be able to go somewhere else and make people sick or violate their rights. So this is something we're a long way from getting past. Mortimer Adler, who was very instrumental at the time in writing the Declaration of Human Rights that was adopted by the United Nations, thought that it would take at least several hundred years for the idea of the nation state to dissolve, and that eventually we would have a world government of federated states that would all belong to the same world system, but each member, each state would be a state similar to the states that exist in the United States.
Perhaps I can give an example today. I was speaking to someone across the road. He's a colored chap and he's Jamaican, and he keeps referring to Jamaica, my home is Jamaica. I said, well, what do you call your residency here in England? He said, I work here, but my roots are in Jamaica, and he wants to go back there pretty quick. I said,
Yeah.
you made your fortune, and he didn't answer that question, but I found it quite interesting.
Well, here's another. Joe wants to jump in now. I'm going to make just one observation.
Yeah.
In the United States, in the 1800s, one of the movements for public funded education was to Americanize the children of immigrants. The idea was, okay, we have all of these people coming in from non-English speaking, non-Anglo American culture, and we might not be able to Americanize that generation, but if we get their children in our public schools and we teach them English as their primary language, that they will very quickly assimilate. And so that was one of the main objectives of, in the United States, providing public money to fund public schools. And I think other countries certainly have the same approach, if not specifically stated for that reason. But we watch television programs produced in the UK all the time, and there are plenty of people who are persons of color who have British accents.
Yeah.
And I doubt if your Jamaican friend does.
Well, he certainly sounds Jamaican.
Joe Polito.
I really enjoyed the last 3 weeks. Certainly learned a lot. The last three segments. Fascinating stuff. Thank you for that.
You're welcome, Joe. Thanks for being here.
It was a bit of a little change of pace from you. I just wanted to comment on your the references to Daniel Boone and some of the things he did, how we look upon it today. But I put in the chat a reference to Adam Hochschild's book, Bury the Chains. He's written a lot of really great books. I think Bury the Chains won an award. I think other books by him have as well. At any rate, he says, as I point out in the chat, he says that in 1780, while democracy was emerging, 3/4 of the world was in some kind of bondage. In Russia, China, and India, most people were serfs, often bought and sold. Africans were enslaving Africans for thousands of years. The legal and cultural system everywhere permitted bondage. And that was true in the Americas as well. In fact, I have read, I don't know how accurate it is, but in Canada, the largest number of slaveholders were people of First Nations, because they would, have territorial disputes, and then the winner would have some kind of bondage arrangement. So,
or be required to pay tribute in order to not be attacked. I mean, that's right. The Iroquois Confederacy, when it was the dominant warrior group of tribes in North America, basically treated other tribes under its domination as their children, and said basically, as long as you behave yourself and every year you come and bring tribute to us, we will allow you to stay where you are in peace. So, I mean, it's not exactly
it's like
slavery.
Racket.
Yeah,
like a protection racket. Yeah, I mean, it's human nature, and it's everywhere. And the book is a great story of how in England they won that battle to abolish slavery, right? And that was a slow process too. In fact, Canada was one of the first places, as it happened historically, to have quite a bit of success that way as well. But at any rate, I think we have to be more humble. If we lived in those eras, how many of us would be any different, right? I mean, we can look back now from the benefit of great education and perspective of history, but human
Well,
beings
I mean,
are,
as you pointed out, on the African continent, there were strong tribes, strong civilizations that subordinated and enslaved weaker ones. And that existed in Asia. It's existed everywhere. And it's only in the last maybe 200 years that very idea has been subjected to moral analysis. So
I
hopefully
think I
we can
read-
continue to do better than our predecessors and our contemporaries have done. And I think most of us would agree that largely the writings of Henry George and people like him provide us with guidance of how to get there to a place where societies are more cooperative, where individuals are driven by cooperative behavior far more than conflict and greed and avarice.
Indeed.
But how long it will take, Joe, I got a feeling that you and I won't be around to see it.
Well, let's be more optimistic than that. But I know in the 20th century, in the early 20th century, I remember reading once, there were as little as 9 what we would call democracies today at times. So, we're come a long way, but obviously with Adolf Putin around, there's lots more to do.
In all societies, there's always this, potential to slip back from progressive, governance, and we have to be diligent. It's far beyond my understanding of how some people can think that in the 21st century that strong charismatic leadership is what is necessary in any society. What we need is cooperative leadership with people who have a strong commitment to human rights.
Yep. People of good character. Like Georgists. Thanks again.
Would anyone else like to join in before we call it a night? I see Mike Curtis, and it looks like he wants to say
I don't know
something.
how to get my hand up. That's the problem.
Oh, well, you can go ahead, Mike. You have the floor.
Thank you, sir. I just say this was a really great presentation. Thank you very much. I've totally enjoyed it. And there's really not much more to say. I couldn't help but think when you were talking about the Patriots, that's how I get these emails that want me to vote for Donald Trump and be a patriot. And I'd have to say in my whole life that the second generation immigrants are clearly the most loyal patriots in America.
That may be true, Mike. I hadn't thought about it in those terms, but
I think it's probably a matter of wanting to belong, but it's the second generation of immigrants who are the children of immigrants who are usually the ones who, without question, they are loyal. And I guess it's a matter of being accepted.
Well, not even accepted, but the pursuit of acceptance. Think about the Japanese Americans who were interred, during the Second World War, and how many of their young men, and I gather some women, entered the U.S. military and fought in the Second World War.
Well, look at
even as their parents and their siblings were put in these internment camps.
Look at how many Black people went to war and fought nobly when they were being oppressed at home, but they wanted to be accepted.
Yeah. It's on the plus side, and I don't know if Black leaders at the time thought that this would be the case. The military turned out to be the first institution in the United States that was desegregated.
Yeah, yeah.
So, you know, that was certainly the demonstration of their patriotism and
Right.
their willingness to fight and die for the country should have brought them a much faster trip to full civil rights than it did.
Full equality, right.
Full equality, yes.
I kept thinking in Vietnam, they were just expending them. And it was
Well,
so sad
um,
because they were loyal and they
Yeah,
fought
yeah.
for this country, right?
that
or wrong.
reminds me before we move on that the International Union is going to be having a webinar titled War, Peace, and Commons Rent. And this is going to be on the 17th, Saturday the 17th, beginning at 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. So
Have it with your breakfast in bed.
you can have it if you live on the East Coast of the United States. If you live on the West Coast, you're going to be very early.
You set the alarm clock.
Yes, but I think it's going to be a really good webinar. Alana Hartzog will be one of the presenters. Charles Avila will be speaking from the Philippines, and Fred Harrison will be speaking from the United Kingdom.
Thank you.
We have a few more minutes. Marty, I'll let you have the last word, and then we'll let Ibrahima close us out.
Yeah, mentioning that event on the 17th, I think Ibrahima should post that because that sounds very interesting. I think this was a real good presentation. I really enjoyed it, and I think
Well, as Joe said, I've sort of moved off of my normal topics, but to tell you the truth, Joe, I've always been much more of a historian than an economist. I just so happen to have chosen as a profession banking and finance when I should have been a history teacher.
The last point that I wanted to make was just that the second generation had baseball as an institution where various races and ethnicities can work out strategy and team, being part of a team and having opponents that they can pal with after they win or lost. So I think it's not only the military, even though that was important, but I think the institution of baseball provided that glue, I think.
Well, it did take until 1947 for Jackie Robinson to be the first African-American to play professional baseball. And so it took a long time, even though there were tremendous Black athletes. And we still have a long way to go with regard to, equality of opportunity, even in athletics. But it's a work in progress. North America, the settlement of North America was and is a work in progress. Frederick Jackson Turner said the frontier ended at the end of the 19th century, but we have new frontiers to conquer for sure. But I thank all of you for joining me on this journey, and I appreciate your comments, and I hope you've learned something new.
Thank you very much, Ed. It was a fantastic series as usual. And I personally feel like this is something that needed to continue, but I understand we reached the slides, the end of the slides. We will not be having session, the reality economics class this week, but we do have an event on housing. It's a webinar, and it's going to be on Thursday, a little bit earlier than usual, 2 p.m. So if you can make it, it's going to be all on Zoom. So please join us, but make sure you register. Thank you and good night.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.